And there we are. Tonight we're going to be following up with the the Talmud and Midrash, something that we've studied in the past couple of years, quite a bit actually, because we read Pirkei Avot in this on the Wednesday nights. We did an extensive study of the Talmud, looking at ideas and concepts in the Talmud rather than reading tractate by chapter, book by book, which we tried a long time ago, and that was a little too much. That was a little too much for people, which is understandable because it is a very difficult book, the Talmud, to sink your teeth into. So we this last year we tried to make it a little bit more more palatable and kind of a little easier to wrap our heads around. And so yeah, we're going to start tonight by kind of, and last week we looked at the Torah and the Tanakh and how, we use those terms kind of interchangeably, but like what's really the difference between the Torah and Tanakh. And I know Esther actually was not able to be here. So let me just show this for a quick second. This is, well, not yet. This will be one of the things that I'm posting up, which is the, hello, right here. This is what we talked about last week, which was the way that the Bible came to us, the Torah, and then the whole Tanakh, the whole Hebrew scriptures came to us from about 1200, when these were oral traditions, we believe, and then to the earliest written sources. We talked about the documentary hypothesis, how these books were written separately and then woven together and redacted, and then eventually again canonized during the period of Ezra. And then the rest of the Bible, the prophets and the writings, are in some cases, most cases, they're being edited because they were already there, but in some cases still being written, like the book of Daniel, which was written, as I mentioned when we read it on the Tuesday, not too long ago, Tuesday class, that it was really edited during the 2nd century BCE. So some of those books were written pretty close to when the Bible itself was edited, but pretty much about 100 years. There's no book that was finished less than 100 years, which I think is important. We didn't mention it last week, but one of the reasons why these books, maybe some of them didn't get into the Hebrew Bible, was because they were too new. So books like the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch and the Book of Maccabees, to some extent, there was no way the Book of Maccabees was going to get in, because first of all, it's very clear that that's a historical book, and it's by a group of people, the Maccabees, the rabbis. We talked about it. They're not really big fans of the Maccabees, and so they weren't really going to preserve their story anyways, but it was also too new. And I think there was a little bit of a feeling that in order for something to be deemed worthy of being in the Bible, or deemed worthy of being canonized, or being a classic, it has to be around for a certain amount of time. I mean, it's kind of like, what's the definition of classic rock? How old does a song have to be able to be considered classic rock? Now, I don't think anybody would say a song from 10 years ago is going to be considered that way. They might enjoy the song, they might really like it, but they're not going to say that's a classic rock song.
Hey, Rabbi.
About 40 or 50 years. And I think when it came to the biblical books, we're talking about hundreds of years. Yes, John.
Hey, do you think when things were being canonized that there were just serious debates among the leading rabbis?
Yeah, well, I showed it last week. I showed you one of those debates, which is the debate about Song of Songs and
Right.
also Ecclesiastes. We don't know that every book was subject to a debate like that, but look, the one that we had in the Talmud that I showed you was a legitimate one, because those are books that are somewhat controversial. Song of Songs, because it's love poetry, which doesn't talk about God at all. And the rabbis interpreted it that it was a love poetry between God and human beings, but maybe it is and maybe it isn't. And then the book of Ecclesiastes, which isn't just philosophical, does talk about God, but is also kind of negative. And we read that not too long ago on Tuesdays to refresh your memory. Some people don't even understand how it made it into the Bible, because it almost seems to be antithetical to some of the other teachings of the Bible. Ecclesiastes, you kind of walk away going, hey, stuff happens. That's the
Right.
kind of the motto of Ecclesiastes. Why? The song, yeah. Everyone likes turn, turn, turn. Yeah, people, we never would have had that song. No, but in all fairness, we wouldn't have because we wouldn't have had Ecclesiastes. So, listen, it's a very powerful book, and we love Ecclesiastes. We read it every year at Sukkot. We actually just were supposed to all be reading it, and we always turn to Ecclesiastes during Sukkot in one way or another. But yeah, the rabbis had a legitimate concern with it. And as I mentioned last week, they had a definite concern with the book of Esther, not so much that they wouldn't have included it, because we don't know that like, they didn't have an argument necessarily about Esther, but we know that it's a very funny book and maybe not meant to be taken seriously. And as I mentioned, it's not part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means that community didn't really want to keep that book. Again, we haven't found it. It could still, maybe it was just, maybe it didn't make it survive. It was there, but it didn't survive. But we found fragments of every other book except for Ecclesiastes. And we also, except for Esther. And we also, as I mentioned, found books of like non-biblical books like the book of Jubilees we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is not in the Bible. So there was definitely debate within the Jewish community and within the rabbinical community of what books were going to be in. So some Jews who were not rabbinical Jews, like the Essenes, maybe the Sadducees, didn't even care about, again, certain books, weren't even going to debate them because they didn't even think they were worthy of being debated. And then there were others that even the rabbis debated. So, yes, the answer to the question is on every level there was debate. And so, around the first century, around the time the temple was destroyed, they canonized it. And partly, we mentioned, they canonized it because they were being murdered and because the decision of what books are actually going to be there needed to be done. Because also during that time, Christianity was coming along and saying, well, we like those, all your books, but we have these other books that we like a lot too that tell the story of Jesus. And the rabbis were going to say, that's definitely not in our Bible. So they had to canonize to also separate. And during this time, and right after, they start, the rabbis start deciding, again, we have to write down our teachings. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, which is this part we talked about last week. And then this part we're talking about today, which is the development of the rabbinic texts, what we call the Talmud. And we're going to be talking about that now. So, the first thing that we want to really kind of share is that the Bible was finished, right? That was canonized. We're not putting any more books in the Bible, but that doesn't mean we're not having some serious questions, and not just about the Bible, but other things that are coming up. Life is continuing. We're challenged with certain things. We're challenged with the fact that the temple is destroyed, for example. That's a huge challenge. What do we do? Now, we can't say we have any more biblical books because we've canonized them. We've said we've closed the door on it, but we still have these questions. And so that's where we start to develop some answers. The rabbis will say, these are not just random answers. These are answers that were passed down to us. And we read this very famous text at the beginning of the book we call Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our sages, the ethics of our fathers. And the line that begins this section, this very famous section it's in the Mishnah, is this line. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and he transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. And they said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. And then they said, Shimon the righteous, and then it continues, Shimon the righteous was one of the last men of the great assembly. And he used to say, the world stands on three things: al ha-Torah, ve'al ha'avodah, ve'al gmilut chasadim. Sounds like a song we sang last night. Pirkei Avot starts this transmission, starts the tradition of transmission, and then we have rabbi after rabbi, the next generation of rabbis, who passed down their teachings and passed down the Torah. Now, why do they have to pass down the Torah? I mean, the Torah was already edited. It was edited by the time that we're reading this. No. What they're saying is that there's another Torah called the Oral Torah, which was never written down. And the Oral Torah is a living conversation which is meant to be the parallel text to the Torah itself, which helps us understand the Torah. Now, the rabbis believed this and taught this, and they believed that that oral Torah was meant to be oral. It was not meant to be written down. It's called the Oral Torah. Now, in Hebrew, that's called Torah Sheba'al Peh. The other Torah, the written Torah, is called Torah Shebichtav, Torah that is written. The written Torah, again, we're pretty much talking about the 5 books because all of the laws are going to be derived from the 5 books. But the oral Torah, that is what the rabbis are telling us is also transmitted, is not meant to be written down. And one of the reasons that it's not meant to be written down is because these are rules, these are laws that have been taught from generation to generation. And once they're written down, of course, we have a paradox. Which law do we follow? Well, the oral law is always based on the written law. They're not disconnected from each other, but the oral law once it's written down, it's not the oral law anymore. And now there's a written law which isn't held to the same esteem that the written Torah was. And the rabbis had no issue saying that the oral Torah was real and was just as authoritative as the written Torah. But once it's written, then you say, okay, well, this is the written compendium of the laws, and then you have a written commentary of the laws. But you can't really say that. And so what's interesting is once they wrote down the oral law, they never stopped calling it the oral law. They called it Torah Sheba'al Peh even when it was written. And they really don't call it Torah Sheba'al Peh, but they call it the Torah. And that's why when we say the word Torah today, as I mentioned last week, we sometimes are talking about the Torah scroll in there. Sometimes we're talking about the whole Bible, the Tanakh. And sometimes we're talking about Jewish law, including the Talmud. Because when people say, I follow the Torah, they don't mean they literally are just following the Torah scroll. They mean that they're following the Talmud and all the Jewish law that comes after, which technically, as we're going to see next week, is even stuff that's written down or taught today. So the Torah never then really stops being revealed. And I don't want to say written because there's always an issue once it's written. But the written Torah has to be based on, the oral Torah has to be based on the written Torah. The idea of writing this down, though, was not one that the rabbis were in unison or uniformity on. There was a definite feeling by some of the rabbis that this can never be written down. That once you write it down, you've created this paradox. You can't say we have an oral Torah that's written down. And so they knew that this was a problem. But to some extent, and again, this is where we have different theories about this. The prevailing wisdom on why this was written down goes to 2 things, which is, on one hand, this was written down during the time when the rabbis also were codifying the Bible, canonizing the Bible, saying this is what's in the Bible, and to some extent, this is what's in the oral law too. And it was done maybe for the similar reason, which is the rabbis are being massacred by the Romans. If we don't know what's in the Bible, and if we don't know the commentary in the Bible, we're not going to know this stuff. We are going to forget it once enough of these people get murdered. You can't pass it down anymore. You can't tell people orally what the thing is if the person that knew it and was teaching it is dead. So you have to write it down, otherwise it's going to be lost because they'll be killed. And there was a real fear of that. I mean, that's a legitimate fear. The Romans are going to kill us. and especially kill the leadership, and it's gone. There's another theory, which you might probably guess why they also wrote it down, was it was getting too big. It was too large. And people were not, there was no way one person could know all of it, the oral law. The written Torah, believe it or not, there were people who memorized the written Torah, and there was people who memorized certain books of the Bible so that if somebody got killed and they didn't have a scroll, that person could start reciting that book. It 100% happened. Again, some of the people, even in those days, had photographic memories, and some people, again, remember, they didn't fill their minds with other stuff back then. They remembered a book of the Bible. And of course, they sang it, which made it a lot easier because you can remember a lot more songs. But come on, at a certain point, you're not going to sing the oral law anyways. So to use the example maybe from Philip as an attorney, as a lawyer, look, it's possible for someone to remember. It is, by the way, it is possible for someone to memorize. Pretty much, they can memorize probably the Constitution. They could, but you can't memorize all the law books that exist, let's say in California, a California penal code or California civil code. You could not memorize that. Nobody can. They can memorize a book, but they can't memorize all of it. So at a certain point, this is not possible for one person to memorize or even a group of people to memorize. So they had to write it down. And yes. Yep. So Esther just asked a wonderful question. How, if you play the game of telephone and it's oral law, how do you know what you started with was what you ended with? That's the wrong question, but it's the question that normally people would ask because I want to know what's the real law. Here's the issue. If it was an oral law, they could change it based on circumstances, and no one would say, we don't follow that law anymore. Why? We stopped teaching that law. And so what happened is once it was fixed, you couldn't do that anymore. So what I'm saying is it's not that the game of telephone, they were afraid of the game of telephone. They embraced the game of telephone because they knew that if someone was teaching the law, and again, you've seen the Talmud before. There are points where the rabbis say, no, the rabbi taught that way, and no, they taught it that way. Well, that's fine because that allowed them to then have a discussion or a debate over it. But that debate was much easier to have when it was oral because then they could hash it out and they could teach it and it didn't become formalized. But that's not what the law was. And so the first attempt, and again, this is a wonderful source, which we use all the time. This is Sepharia, which has all the biblical books. It's all in the top. This is an amazing source, right? This is, to me, one of the greatest things that's on the internet. I mean, look, I'm a simple, stupid person who is not using the internet maybe for all its wonderful things. There's a lot of garbage there too, obviously, but Sepharia is one of the greatest things that I think ever. This has not only the whole Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, it also has the rabbinic texts, which some of them, well, almost all of these we're going to look at in the coming months. But looking at and we looked at the Talmud, but to look at the Mishnah first, this is the first thing that the rabbis wrote down from the oral law. And they wrote down the Mishnah. Again, they codified it around 200. We know the rabbi who was responsible for this, editing and creating this, and that's Judah Hanasi. We talked about him as we went through the different rabbis a few months ago. We read about Judah Hanasi. He was a very important rabbi, part of the Hillel dynasty. So one of his great grandfathers was Rabbi Hillel, and Rabbi Judah Hanasi was very close to the Romans too. He worked during his time of authority, and he was basically the leader that the Romans interacted with during this second and early third century, around the 200s. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome, and the rabbis had kind of imagined that Marcus Aurelius and Judah Hanasi had conversations with each other. We don't know that they did, but they imagined that they did. There's wonderful texts that we read of the rabbis going back and of Rabbi Judah Hanasi going back and forth with Marcus Aurelius. We read these great stories. They call him Antoninus in the Talmud, in the Talmudic stories. But it's Judah Hanassi's job to edit this and to put this into sections. And so he put it into 6 sections. And you can see these are the 6 sections, and it's organized into 63 tractates, 63 sections that are part of these 6 books, or 6 orders, as we call them. The first one is called Zraim, and Zraim has several chapters, including Brachot, which are blessings, Peah, which is about how to take care of our fields so that we can have food for the poor, that they can come. Zraim is basically agriculture, but because some of it has prayers in it, we have this wonderful tractate of Brachot, which we've studied before, but not in the Mishnah, in the Talmud. I'll explain that when we talk about the difference between them. But this is the first of the sections, Zraim, agriculture. The next section is Moed, which is about holidays. Very important section, because this section has the laws of how do we keep these different holidays. And you can see Shabbat has a section, Rosh Hashanah has a section. As we mentioned, there's no section about Hanukkah, because Hanukkah was not something they really knew about. Hanukkah comes out of this section, out of Shabbat, and a discussion about making wicks. That's a very important section of the Mishnah. The next section is Nashim, which is technically, literally, women. Nashim are women. It's family law. And here we have laws about ketubas, about marriages, certain kinds of marriages, the Nazarite laws in Gittin. Philip, this is about divorce. There's a whole tractate. Yes. And as Philip says, it's family law. And it's called Gittin because it's about getting the get, the bill of divorce. Now, again, this is the Mishnah. The next section is Nezikin, which is civil, it's damages. And this is different sections about different types of situations people would get into. Property damage, losing things, or having something, what happens if you lost something and somebody found it, and then, of course, contracts, section on Sanhedrin about how to establish courts. And then we get into the last two orders, which have these tractates. So again, these are the tractates within each one. So, it's about 10 tractates in each book, in each one of the order. We call them orders. And the reason I say orders and not books is we call them orders, but there's another reason why we don't really call them books, because very rarely do people study the Mishnah by itself. The next one is Kedoshim, which is about sacrifices, the way the temple was supposed to be administered. And the next section, Taharot, is also about things that the priests would be very worried about, but also includes things about holiness and purity, which extend to things that even if you're not a priest, you're worried about, like how a corpse makes something impure, or how to create the proper mikvahs for your community. What happens to a woman during her menstruation, so when she goes to a mikvah. So all of these things are part of the this last order. These are the tractates that are part of this. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the Mishnah is organized in a very orderly way, with each one of these tractates pretty much, and I'll show you just an example. I mean, I can pull any of them, but I'll do this one since we just had a question, what is challah? Well, here's a wonderful order about having to remove some of the wheat in order to make what we call challah, which is not necessarily the braided bread that we have. It's bread where we've taken out a piece of it so that we can fulfill the obligation of doing what we need to do, which is basically set aside a little bit for the priests. So here's a whole tractate about it. And here's again, discussion about the dough, the bakers, all this kind of stuff. This is all laws about the dough. Yes. 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 Challah has been taken. And it actually will say challah has been taken. Yes. 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 if it's kosher. If it's just some challah, some of the bread was taken and burned to again replicate the priestly ritual. So if you ever see bread that says challah is taken, actually you'll see it too on matzah. If you get a kosher, I mean, most people get kosher matzah, it'll say challah has been taken. That means they took a little bit out to burn. Yeah, is not kosher, not necessarily kosher. Well, yes, if it's frozen, comes from a kosher bakery, it is. If you went to Dink's, challah is not. That's technically not kosher challah.
Hey, Rabbi,
So yes,
I got a
yeah,
quick
yeah,
question. Um,
yes,
y- again, you may have answered this sometime in all the study, but
right, right.
if Deuteronomy is giving us the laws, what's the purpose of halakha?
So the issue is, and it's a good question because like, why do we need these laws? Because remember right at the beginning of that little part that I told you, when when Shimon Hatzadik, even before that, when the men of the assembly said, "What do you have to do? You have to raise up many disciples, and you have to protect the Torah. You have to put a fence around the Torah." And so, just to show you what I'm talking about here, whoa, to go back to that very famous section from Pirkei Avot, when it says that Moses received the Torah and transmitted it down to the men of the great assembly, which puts us around 200 BCE. Be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So this concept of a siag Torah, keeping a fence around the Torah, is one of the reasons why, again, to answer your question, why are all the laws, the 613 commandments are in the Torah? Why do we need halakha? Why do we need the Mishnah? And we haven't used that term yet, but that's 100% the correct term, John. The halakha, the law, it is to do this, to make a fence around the Torah, to make sure that we follow the Torah correctly. So all the commandments and all the extra rules that we have in the Mishnah and later on in the Talmud are to make sure we do not break the Torah. So that creating that fence is what the concept is. Look, it's a similar issue to, of course, what we have in our country, which is we have a constitution, and some people are of the impression that in order to protect the Constitution, we need to some extent create other laws that protect the spirit of the Constitution. There are other people who say no, if it's not in the Constitution, we're not going to do it. Well, the rabbis are definitely of the former group, which is no, we're gonna make these laws. The people who said we're not going to make new laws were the Sadducees, and they disappeared. Part of the reason why they didn't want to make new laws is because they functioned around the temple. And if the temple didn't exist, then they were kind of out of a job. Well, they were, but like for them, let's just get the temple rebuilt. Well, it didn't happen. And so the rabbis won, partly because they created a system that worked even without a temple. But you understand why the Sadducees said, if it's not there, you're not going to make it up. So they were much more the strict. When I was a kid, we would have said they were strict constitutionalists, but they weren't. They were. It was more than that, which was that they were trying to prohibit them. They didn't want the rabbis to basically create a religion that was separate from the temple. And the rabbis' argument was, it's not like we were going to forget the temple. I just showed you there's two orders with about 20 tractates that are nothing about besides laws about how to run the temple. And they're not all about it, but in the Mishnah they're really about it. Actually, it's open here, so let me just show it to you. So these sections in the Mishnah that deal with the ones that come here at the end, Kodoshim and Tarot. I mean, just to open up one for example. I mean, look at these tractates. This one on Hulin. You know, um, they're going through the. Well, this happens to be slaughtering the animals. You could argue, not just for not just for the altar, but for any kind of slaughtering. So maybe it's not the best one, but let me show you one that's just This one's just about this tractate was just about. I mean, this whole thing right here was all about offerings at the temple. I mean, this is nothing, this is no practical use for anything that an average person would do. It's only about what the priest would do for the temple service. So to say that the rabbis weren't concerned with the temple is not true. But again, they created a whole lot of stuff on the holidays and other things which the priests didn't, quite frankly, didn't care about. So, you know, that's really important to it's really important to comment on that. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So, yes, Philip. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, according to the rabbis, there would have been. Yes, today. Yes, yes. If it was today, yes, yeah. That's one of the reasons why I'm not in a real big rush like most Jews to have it come back. I don't even want to think about it because, look, just the administration of it is going to cause chaos because you're going to have priests fighting over who has control of it because that's what happened the last time we had the temple. It was priests were fighting amongst themselves for control. And guess what? It's the same thing is going to happen because at the end of the day, this is about money and control. So you're going to have people killing each other over it. Forget the fact the animals. Like I'm not stupid. I'm not. If it was just killing the animals, and as a vegetarian, I wouldn't love it. But if people really loved it and it was something that made them feel better, okay. In the scheme of the amount of animals we're killing, it's not that big of a deal. Honestly, I mean, I'm practical about that. But forget that. People would kill each other over this. And they did. The last time we had a temple, these different priests would kill each other over who got to be the priest. And they paid the Romans, and the Romans would kill the person who they didn't want anymore, if they outbid for that. It was a terrible situation. And I guarantee you, it's just a nightmare. So, yes, yes. And up until that time, so the question, another great question. The question is, what about before the temple? Before the temple, people offered sacrifices anywhere they wanted to. And of course, that is a little bit of a problem because once we had a priesthood that was in power, they didn't want people to do that anymore. And so, yeah, then it became centralized in Jerusalem and only in Jerusalem. And they didn't want people offering sacrifices anywhere. But yes, originally before the time of David and Solomon, and then even after when the northern kingdoms separated, they were not just going to Jerusalem. Definitely the people in the north were not just going to Jerusalem. But our ancestors, the Jews, the Judeans, they only wanted sacrifices in Jerusalem. So, yes, that was a major issue. And it's in the Torah and we've talked about it before, and unfortunately weren't there when we talked about it. It's one of the stories that goes on in the Bible that people don't talk about, which is that fight between Levites who were offering sacrifices anywhere, and the Kohanim, the priests who were only offering sacrifices in Jerusalem. And then, as I said, even within Jerusalem, there was fights over which family would be in power. Not good. And again, as the Jewish community grew, it became impossible to run this system the way it was during the biblical period when the community was 1/100th of the size. The temple cult was never meant to be for a community of 8 million people, which is what we think the Jewish community was at the time of the destruction of the temple. There were 8 million Jews maybe in the world running a system that was designed for a couple 100,000. It didn't make sense. And it created really big problems on a systemic level where people just they just couldn't handle it, and it created really bad situations, which it would now. I mean, now we don't have that many more Jews than we did 2,000 years ago, unfortunately, but it would not be good. So let us now move into the development of the Talmud. And that is, well, I'm going to kind of go back and forth between other this other chart. As you can see, the Mishnah was finished around 200, and then we have the composition of other things, which we're going to get to in a second, like the Midrash, Tosefta and Midrash. And then, as we know from history, once you have one book that was written down, you can't help yourself from writing down more books. And the more book, the bigger book, the more is what we call the Gemara. And this is the famous equation that you can always remember. The Mishnah, that first 6 orders and 63 tractates, the commentary on it is called the Gemara. And together we call it the Talmud. And very, very regular, very uncommon for us to just read the Mishnah by itself. We normally read it with the accompanying Gemara. And what, of course, is confusing is we have 2 different Gemaras. We have one that was written in Jerusalem, in Israel, not really in Jerusalem, but we call it the Jerusalem. Some people call it the Palestinian Talmud, but we don't call it that so much today. It was written in Roman Palestine, or in Rome, in the land of Israel, during the Roman period. And then there was another one that was written in Babylonia, which wasn't really written in Babylonia. It was written in modern day Iraq. Which is, I mean, Babylon was in Iraq, but it was a little bit broader of an area than just Iraq, by the way. But what's interesting is they have the same Mishnah. The Mishnah text on both of them is the same. The same. What's different is the Gemara. And what's interesting is you'd think maybe that we would follow the one that was written in Israel. We don't. We, for the last 1,500 years, because again, this one was finished a little bit later, by the way. So this one was a little bit earlier, about 100, 200 years earlier. We finished the Jerusalem. What? Oh, sorry. I'm not showing the right slide. I'm showing a slide that I have up on my screen, but you don't have. Sorry. Thank you, Mary. This is the Mishnah plus Gemara equals Talmud. Let's say that again. This is the Jerusalem Talmud, which again, about 400. The Babylonian Talmud, 500 to 600. And even though this one's older, and even though this one was written in Jerusalem, we actually followed this one. So Babylonia, which again, modern day, really Iraq and Iran, this is the one we follow. Both of them were written in Aramaic. Both of them are written and quote some of the same rabbis. But the Jerusalem Talmud is actually shorter and doesn't have as many tractates. And the Babylonian Talmud is more organized and has a lot more discussion. And the Babylonian Talmud is a little bit more fun. By fun, I mean the discussions in it are crazy in some cases, but they are where you learn and you go off into a tangent. The Jerusalem Talmud is not really like that. It's much more direct. There's not a lot of crazy tangents. And that's not the reason why we don't study it as much. It's because of this. The Jerusalem Talmud focused on life in the land of Israel, life under the Roman rule, had a lot more about the temple rules, whereas the Babylonian Talmud was about diaspora life, what it's like to live outside the land of Israel. And for the last 1,500 years, most Jews, the vast majority of Jews, did not live in the land of Israel. So this became a much more important part of our lives, the Babylonian Talmud. Again, today, it's important, but definitely less quoted by the rabbis. The Talmud, we call the Babylonian, the Bavli, is the text besides the Torah. After the Torah, it's the next most quoted book. And I said Torah, by the way, and let me definitely qualify that. I actually mean the five books because in the Orthodox world, in the Torah centered world, where we're talking about following Jewish law, people know the Talmud more than they know the rest of the Bible. So when you and I, and definitely us, and I by us I mean Temple Beth Ami, when we've spent the better part of the last 5 years reading the books of the prophets and the books of the writings, most Orthodox groups will not study those books like we did. They will spend a lot of time studying the Torah, and they will spend a lot of time studying the Talmud. They will spend a lot less time in what we call the Nach, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Those other 2/3 of the Bible. So when I'm saying Torah, I'm being specific, like the five books. The Torah and the Talmud will be the ones that are studied the most. The editions that are usually studied of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, we normally study out of what's called the Vilna edition, which I'll show you a page in a second. And that goes back about 150 years. And then, gosh, it's weird to say 150 years. When I started studying Talmud, it was 100 years. It's now 150 years. Anyways, the Venice edition of the Jerusalem Talmud goes back even longer. The printed edition that was often worked off of goes back about 500 years. A lot of the scholars are the same in both. And again, some of them are more prevalent in the Babylonian Talmud because these are Babylonian rabbis. These rabbis are rabbis that Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, they're in the other Talmud. Some of you guys remember these stories because we talked about them from the Babylonian Talmud. They're there, but these guys, because they were living in the land of Israel during this period, they're often quoted in the Palestinian or Jerusalem. And again, when we talk about the impact that they have, especially today, the Jerusalem Talmud became very important for people in the land of Israel, and also to some extent for the Yemenite and Italian traditions, which you can see, they studied it in Venice. But in most of the world, most of Europe, especially Eastern and Central Europe, where most Jews lived, North Africa, and most of the Sephardic areas, with the exception of places like the land of Israel and Yemen, they studied the Babylonian. Much longer, and it's much tougher to study to some extent because it's so much longer and it's so much more, goes on so many more tangents. But of course, it has wonderful texts, and we've studied them. Also, the Ein Yaakov, we not only study the Halakha, we study the Agadic and the legend texts in there too, which is where we derive a lot of our inspirational material and a lot of the great, if you will, midrashic texts. Now we'll get to that in a second, what I mean by that. But I do want to make one point before we move off of the Talmud, which is you can imagine that the Jerusalem Talmud has come back into frequent study in the last 75 years. Because for the Jews that live in Israel, when you want to know about traditions of how to treat the land of Israel, especially agricultural laws in the land of Israel, like how do we follow the laws of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, you got to go to this book because you're not going to find it in the Babylonian one. Well, you'll find it, but it's very little discussion about it because it's not a law for the diaspora. The Shemitah year is only a law for people who live in Israel. You don't have to lay your land fallow for, every seventh year in California. You do have to do it in Israel. And when you want to know how to do it, you got to go back to the Jerusalem Talmud. So definitely this has become a lot more important in the last 75 years. There's more and more people that are studying it now than ever before because they live in the land of Israel. So the Babylonian Talmud has quite a lot of, even though, again, it's there for law, quite a lot of discussions that are not just about law. Some of them are, as it says right here, or kind of about the concepts of how do we analyze things, how do we discuss things, and how do we engage in logical arguments over things. The the Jerusalem Talmud is not really concerned with that, but the Babylonian Talmud is. And so I'm going to share with you a very famous part of the text that we studied. We've studied it many times, but there's never really enough that we can spend on studying the Talmud without studying, again, this very, very famous text that we talk about, which is um, the oven of Achnai. This is from the tractate in the Talmud called Bava Metzia, the Middle Gate, which is about civil law. The discussion that we have here has nothing to do with civil law. It has to do with a discussion about an oven and whether it's kosher or not. And then, of course, the rabbis get into this discussion of the kosher oven, which is not really about the oven at all, which is about the system of coming up with a decision. And what is most important, and you could say maybe this is the principal argument, and I didn't make this statement. Multiple rabbis have made this statement that this text of the oven of Achnai from page 59b, and we'll mention that in a second, how we even get to those numbers. This is the text. And for those who forgot, you'll remember it right away. Rabbi Eliezer, right, says that the oven in dispute is kosher. And he answered all the possible answers in the world to support his opinion. But the rabbis did not accept his explanations. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, remember this now, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits, right? They can't even come into agreement on how far the tree flew. But it flew. It flew. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from a carob tree. Sorry, Rabbi, that proves nothing. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. And the water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from a stream. So all the other rabbis said to Rabbi Eliezer, sorry, doesn't count. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? So essentially saying to the supernatural act that was happening there, stay out of this. We're discussing this. Stay out of it. Now, of course, he's not really speaking to the walls. He's speaking to God. And if you don't think he's speaking to God, read the next line. The walls did not fall because of the deference to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten out because of the deference of Rabbi Eliezer. And they still remain leaning, which is probably an explanation for why their study hall was leaning. This is an explanation of why our study hall, it was a debate that caused this, right? The supernatural debate. Rabbi Eliezer then said, this is the end, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha is always in accordance with him in every place. He's always right. Listen to him. That is God, Bat Kol, which is the divine voice. And we love this very famous scene. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written in the Torah, Lo bashamayim he, which we just read in Deuteronomy. The Torah is not in heaven. It is not in heaven. The rabbis quoted the Torah back to God. It is not in heaven. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai, also in the Torah, after a majority to incline. So in Exodus, you also said, God, right after you gave the Ten Commandments, you got to follow the majority. Majority rules in a halakhic debate. Since the rabbis, the majority, disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer, the halakha is not his opinion. And so the story is amazing because it basically says the rabbis quote God's Torah back to God to prove that God can't be involved in this anymore, which is, again, this idea that revelation has now been replaced to some extent with understanding what's been revealed. And the revelation comes about through the study, not through God adding new laws to it anymore. It's a it's like, God, you've sealed the book. We're done with it. Now it's up to us to decide how to follow it. And what's very important about that is you have to follow the majority. This is a very important concept in Judaism as well, which is that one person can't go out and start saying, but that's not what we do. And remember, Rabbi Eliezer lived at the same time as Jesus and his followers. And when Rabbi Eliezer says, that's not the way it is, and God, tell me it's not the way it is, the rabbis are also asserting, we don't hear any other voices anymore. Nobody's going to tell you that's what God said. Because, God, you've already said it's not in heaven anymore. It's in the book. And so the rabbis quoted God back to him twice. Number one, it's not in heaven. And number two, we have to follow the majority of opinions when it comes to deciding how to follow halakha. It's not just we interpret it, but the majority of people interpreting a certain way is the way we're going to follow it. Because you can interpret it lots of ways, but if the majority of rabbis are saying it this way, one rabbi can't come in and do that. And that's what he was doing, because the walls of the building almost came tumbling down because one guy decided he was going to go his own way. So it's really obviously a bigger thing, which is the collapse of the whole system. The system breaks down if every rabbi can go off and start his own teachings. So you have to follow the majority. Now, yes. In heaven. Yeah. Yes. It is also, if you think about it, and my professor, Richard Friedman, who wrote the Bible, he also wrote a book called The Disappearance of God. He wrote a book that basically said this scene is the Jewish answer to Jesus, which is, you cannot do this anymore, God. You can't play around anymore by putting new rules into effect, by having new voices come forward and say, yeah, but everything I said before, that doesn't matter anymore. No, you made the rules, you've set the rules, you can't go back on the rules anymore. You've told us. Now, that's not the end of the story, because the postscript of the story is, well, what did God think about this? What does God think about this? And this is what they say. Years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah, right? And Elijah goes back and forth to heaven. So he knows what's going on in heaven. So Rabbi Natan said to Elijah, what did God do at that time? Right? When Rabbi Yeshua said, Lo bashamayim he, what did God say? And Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me.
Why?
Said it with a smile, it says. It does. That's not a commentary. He smiled and said, my children have defeated me. It's sometimes translated is defeated. My children are right. And so what it says is that God, what's God going to say? And it's like a parent whose kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And when the parent says, yeah, but I changed my mind. And they say, sorry, Dad, you made the rule. We're following the rule, because we have to be a nation. We have to be a people of rules. And it can't be, well, I have a new revelation and now we're going to undo everything that just came before, because the whole system collapses. Who do we listen to? And so the rabbi said, we can't listen to one voice, and we can't listen to people stepping forward and going, and God said, you don't do that anymore. Because that's exactly what happened with the church and with the early church. And people said, you can't do that. And that's what the rabbis just did. And to some extent, this starts rabbinic Judaism. This concept of lo bashamayim he, that now you've given it to us, it's not in heaven anymore. And that's why I shared the story, is because this is the story that rabbinic law to some extent is based on. And of course, it also shows you how the rabbis discuss these things, and also this concept of, okay, but at the end of the day, every rabbi says one thing and one says the other. What is the majority decides? The majority of scholars who look at it, and then they're not just saying, oh, let's have a vote. It's not just, we got a bunch of people together and they all held up their hands. No, they discussed it. They debated it. They heard the different arguments, and then they decided, What are we doing? Well, I think we got to follow this way. So this isn't just let's just get a bunch of people together and vote on it. It's not what we're talking about. Yeah, Philip. Is a statute, yes.
And then court determines, oh, what you did was a crime, because we just came up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, it has to be. Even again, in cases where people say, "Yeah, that should be against the law," they say, "Well, you got to make it a law." So
What was
yeah, this
Philip's question,
concept that,
Rabbi?
that God agreed with this, and God went along with it, and God was happy to some. Again, God smiled because God says, "You know what? They're following the rules. I gave them the rules, and they're following the rules. And what are you going to say?" And again, I mean, it's not. This is the rabbis telling the story of essentially how they come to this conclusion that what they're doing is following God's ways, right? They're not just, well, we decided we're going to write a Talmud. Well, no, they believe that they are trying to protect and follow the law that God gave them. Is God giving up an omnipotence? That is in the disappearance of God. If you want to turn to Friedman's argument, yes, to some extent, it's God relinquishing control. And it's not the only version of this, which some would say, and he says to some extent, the Bible itself sets that up. Why? Because one of the last books of the Bible, and this is why, again, the rabbis, are having these kinds of discussions. When we get to the last books, God isn't really there. And of course, the argument of why the Essenes didn't have the book of Esther, God's not mentioned once in the book of Esther. So if God isn't there, you know, then God kind of retreated even during the Bible. Friedman's, I mean, we had talked about it when he was my professor. One of the things that he made the argument, and I think he has a pretty solid argument for anybody who's studied the Bible even a little bit. As you get to the later books of the Bible, we also have less and less miracles, right? People are like, why are there no miracles in the book of Kings? Part of it is this idea that God has retreated and essentially like turned more and more over to human beings, and that God is not going to do those kinds of things. And the miracles that God does not only are less frequent, but they're less and less dramatic, right? So at the beginning, God is washing away the whole world in the book of Noah. God is splitting the Red Sea for the Israelites. But as we get to the later miracles, God is like performing them for a smaller and smaller group of people. And so the miracles become a lot less dramatic and powerful to some extent within the Bible itself. That's not our interpretation. That's what the Bible does. And so you can look at the text. And now, as I've kind of introduced this, let's talk about this other piece of the puzzle of rabbinic texts, which is what we call the Midrash. Now, the Midrash is being written around the same time. And what's important is that there isn't a book of Midrash. There's collections of Midrashim. And as we looked at when we were studying the Talmud, when we did the Ein Yaakov, I purposely took out and we studied. I didn't take it out. The Ein Yaakov exists because there were rabbis who did it a long time ago, said, let's read the Agadah. Let's not read just the Halakha, or in some cases, let's pull this out so we can show people the Agadah, the legend that exists within the Talmud, because number one, it's very inspirational, it's entertaining, and it also explains things. And again, this is not written at a different time. It's not like rabbis are writing Agadah, legend, and they're writing Halakha. That's what we call Agadah and Halakha. And by the way, to say it's legend is kind of dismissive of it, because when we say Agadah, we say it's legend, that means like people think it's like fantasy. It's not fantasy, it's explanation, and it's actually, in some cases, really important explanation for us to understand, like, why does the Bible tell us certain stories and it seems to be omitting really, really important things? And there's questions, right? And so the Midrash does one really important thing, is that it fills in the gaps, it fills in the blanks. A lot of times we were like, what's Noah's wife's name? Well, that's in the Midrash. It's not in the Torah. And the rabbis said that the Midrash, because it's rabbinic, it's oral Torah, the rabbis believe that it's been passed down along with the halacha. It's been passed down through the generations. So they don't see it as like separate from the law. It's being written and it's being edited together at the same time. So um, again, to show people what we're talking about, this is when these collections are being edited. So one is where it says the early Midrash and where it says Midrash Rabbah. So the Tosefta are collections of texts that are written after the Mishnah, at the same time as the Mishnah and after the Mishnah, which some of them go into the two Talmud versions, but they're also in some cases kept and preserved outside of the Talmud. And these Tosefta collections are primarily halakha, they're primarily law. But the collections of Midrash, one of the biggest that we call the Midrash Rabbah, which means literally the great Midrash. These are collections that people start assembling of Midrash. And as I said, a lot of the Midrash are within the Bavli itself. Like, for example, that story we just read of the oven of Achnai. I mean, there's a law there. They're arguing over the oven, but really, that's an Agadah. That's really a legend. That's really a story. It's a narrative, right? It's obviously a very important narrative, but it's a narrative. The Midrash collections, and we've studied Midrash extensively. I love Midrash. I love the work of Midrash because it explains things, and it also is very inspiring. It's great stories, and we are at the root of it. I think Jewish people are great storytellers. We're also going to look at that too. Next week, we're going to look at the development of Jewish law after the Babylonian Talmud. We'll talk about Jewish law beyond that, beyond this date. But after that, even though I thought maybe we'd push it to later, we're actually going to look at Jewish fiction and Jewish legend and Jewish stories after. So we're going to do Jewish law next week, and the week after that, we're going to do Jewish stories. The next week, by the way, we're going to be virtual only because I will be out of town. I'll be in San Diego, but we're going to do Jewish law after the Babylonian Talmud. And then, as I said, the week after, we're going to do Jewish fiction and Jewish stories after. But let's look a little Midrash because it's impossible. And again, you can't, I mean, we could have done one day just about Jewish halakha today, rabbinic halakha, and then another one about Agadah. But I don't like doing that because they were written at the same time, and they really are, they're not separate. They're woven together in the Talmud especially, and they're not meant to be really studied separately. So we did do that because I knew it would be very hard to study Jewish law. And when you study the Ein Yaakov, which is the collections of the Agadah out of the Talmud, you get really great stories. And we did study those. And it was really a lot of fun to study the Ein Yaakov. But it's a little bit based on the fact that, look, we don't live in a halachic world. We don't live in a world where we're arguing over Jewish law, because most of us follow Jewish law to a certain extent, but obviously, we're not living on a daily basis wondering whether or not, certain things are kosher or not. Let's put it that way. But let's look at a little Midrash, and specifically, I thought it would be good to look at a little Midrash on this week's Torah portion, which is creation. But this story, actually, of course, is a great meta story about what the rabbis are also involved in, which is trying to figure out how to keep our people going. But this is a wonderful story because, it's based on this perplexing line from Genesis, from the first chapter, as a matter of fact. It says in Genesis chapter 1, when God made human beings, God says, let us make man in our image. Now, that's a little bit of a problem because who's God talking to? Now, of course, Christians are like, well, he's talking to Jesus. He's talking to the Trinity. He's talking within himself. But of course, it's also very possible, as the rabbis kind of felt a little bit, again, not unlike other people in those days, said that God is talking to the angels. He consulted with the angels. And so here's a wonderful story. There's actually several parts of this, but I'm going to read you part of this. This is from the collection called Breshit Rabbah, which means Genesis Rabbah. And this is towards the beginning of it, which is discussions about creation and particularly creations of human beings. So God is talking to the angels, and God is going to create human beings. And I'll show you this part first. Wait, yeah, I'll show you this part first. So God was going to create Adam, and he foresaw righteous and wicked people descending from him. He said, if I create him, wicked people will descend from him. But if I do not create him, how will righteous people ever descend from him? So he started talking to the angels about it. Now, I don't want to get into this section because this section's the better section. It's a similar discussion, but let me just show you this part. Rabbi Simon said, when the Holy One, and you can read this whole section, by the way, if you read all of chapter 8 about creation, it's wonderful. Where do you start? You start at the beginning. I mean, you can't even pick out one part of this, but I want you to see this part. This is paragraph 5. So this is 8:5. Rabbi Simon said, Shimon, when the Holy One, blessed be he, came to create Adam, the first man, the ministering angels divided into various factions and various groups. So, we've talked about the angels in the previous paragraphs, but look at this one. So the angels start to get in different groups. Some of them are saying, let him not be created. And some of them are saying, let him be created. Again, for similar reasons. They're going to be good. They're going to be bad. They're going to be good. They're going to be bad.
Even the angels couldn't agree.
Yeah. Well,
even they were fighting. Why is it new the Jews are fighting each other?
Yes. Well, they're like us, right? A little bit. They're a little bit like us. They're a little bit like God. They're a little bit like us. Let him not be created. Some of them were saying, let him be created. That is what is written. Kindness and truth met, and righteous and peace touched. It's a line from Psalms. So the rabbis love in the Midrash, not just to talk about a line from Genesis or Exodus or wherever they're talking about, but then let's get a part from Psalms. We're going to get a piece from another whole section of the Bible and quote it. Why? Because they loved interconnection. They loved the intertextuality of the Bible, and they wanted it. They're not separate. They're all connected. All these words are connected. Kindness said, well, what's kindness? This is literally the embodiment of kindness, right? The angel of kindness, if you will. Let him be created as he performs acts of kindness. Truth said, let him not be created as he is full of lies. So kindness and truth argued with each other. I love this image of these angels, these personifications of these things. And they're all angels, right? So they're not wrong. Kindness is kind, right? Truth is, emet. I guess his name would have been Emet because that's what emet means in Hebrew. Emes. Righteousness said, let him be created as he performs acts of tzedakah, acts of righteousness. But peace said, let him not be created as he is full of discord. Peace didn't. We know how not peaceful these people are. What? Wait, Esther, you're jumping the gun. Well, they know because they're angels, right? They can foresee what happens. But you're 100% right. You're jumping ahead. But what did the Holy One, blessed be do? Blessed be he do? He took truth and cast it down on earth. That is what is written, and you cast truth downward, earthward, towards the earth, which is from Daniel. Again, a book of the Bible that they don't often quote, but they found a way to work and in there. The ministering angel said before the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the universe, why are you demeaning your very seal? Let truth ascend from the earth. That is what is written in Psalms. Truth will spring from the earth. So they quote Psalm somewhere else where the angel said, get truth off the earth. You're demeaning earth is not the place for truth. Truth belongs up here. Remember, truth was the one who said they shouldn't be created. So God kind of said, yeah, you better get down there, truth. If you don't want them to not be truthful, you better be down there. But the angel said, you better get truth back up here. The rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Hanina Bar Edi, and Rabbi Pinchas and Rabbi Hilkiah said it in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Me'od, this refers to man, Adam. And that is what is written. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. What is Tov Me'od? It is human beings. God is Me'od. Why? Why? Well, you got to know a little bit of Hebrew. Adam and Me'od are written with the same letters. It's a play on the Hebrew. Aleph, right? Daled, Mem, spells Adam. And Mem, Aleph, Daled, spelled Me'od. So it's an anagram, right? It's like M-A-D. By the way, it's like M-A-D, right? M-A-D would be, or A-D-M would be Adam, A-D-M, and Me'od is M-A-D. So it's an anagram.
Is that your interpretation?
Be like, no, that's what it is. That's why it says. That's what it says. Adam and Me'od are written with the same letters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, actually, I'll show you since you can see the letters. So there's Emet, that means truth, but here's Adam, right? See, Adam is Aleph, Daled, Mem.
Mm-hmm.
And Me'od is Me'od is here. Mem, Aleph, Daled. Now this is the final Mem. This is the whole Mem, the beginning Mem. So it's Aleph, Daled, Mem, and this is Aleph, Daled, Mem. So it's the final Mem. So that's the word, right? So it's a play, right? It's a play on language. It's a play on words. It's a word game, right? Adam and Me'od. It's wonderful, right? He is Me'od. He's good. Very, not just good, very good. He is Me'od. Tov is good, but Me'od is very good. Adam was good, very good. Okay, this is awesome because that's not the end of the story. So, okay, it's a play on words. No, that's not where it ends. Rav Huna, the Rabbi Tzipori, right? That's where we saw the beautiful mosaic floors. Rav Huna lived there. He said, I love this line. While the ministering angels were busy deliberating with one another and engaging with one another, the Holy Blessed be He created him. He said to him, why are you deliberating? Man's already been created. So all the angels are debating like rabbis, right? God just did it. He didn't wait. He said, it's already done. I already did it. It's too late. You can't do anything about it. I did it. So God listened to the angels only to a certain extent because he just did it. You could keep talking. I already made them. So it shows you that the angels are not super happy, at least some of them, that we were created because they knew what we were potentially going to do. Now, the rabbis still haven't really gotten into the issue of why does it say we? Because, well, he kind of consulted them and then he did it. I will show you, and again, this is just all such good stuff. I mean, we studied this, by the way, for those who studied Midrash, which I don't know anybody here was on our Tuesday morning class like 5 years ago, but actually it was probably 10 years ago that we read the section on creation. But this is just wonderful stuff, just the stuff on creation. So there's this discussion about what it means to be for God to gosh, all this stuff is so good. Like, did God really talk to the other angels, to the angels about this? And Rabbi Levi says, these are all good. Says, it's like a king who's walking by the entrance of a palace. He sees a large hewn rock off to the side. He says, what should we use this for? Like to his courtiers, right? Some of the desires say, use it for public baths. And others say, use it for private bathhouses. So let the public enjoy it. No, no, let's make it for us, right? The king said, I'm going to craft it in a statue. Like they were both arguing over what to do, and he's like, "No, I'm making a statue out of it." King does whatever he wants. So I love that. It's like you see it all the time. You know, these people are arguing over it, and it doesn't really matter because he's going to do it anyways. So that's a nice little story. But then we get into like, but what does this really mean, right? Um, look at this line right here. I'm just going to show it to you because we're here. It's so good. It says right at the beginning, God created Baru Elohim. No, it says bara Elohim. When God created man, it doesn't say we created man. It would be Baru Elohim, that God and the angels created him. It just says that God created man. Now it does say, let us create man. And then it says, and God created man. So the rabbi said, well, he seems to be talking to people, but then he doesn't talk to them anymore. He talks to the angels, or should we make him, and then he just does it. Now, part of the problem is the word Elohim is a plural word. So some people would say, no, no, no. There's more than one person here. And it says the heretics once came to Rabbi Samlai and said, how many deities created the world? And he said to them, let you and I inquire into the early days, right? It doesn't say, he looks back at the Torah and he says, it doesn't say Baru, they created it. It says that God singularly created, right? It doesn't say by itself, when it says, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, he said to them, read what is written afterwards. And God created man in their image? No, it doesn't say that. It says God created man in his image. And of course, the rabbi's students say to him, why did you give him such a simple answer? And he goes, well, because I didn't want to give him the full long answer, but the long answer is that, guys, sometimes a person's known by more than one name. When we talk about Augustus Caesar, we could call him Caesar, or you could call him Augustus Caesar, or you could call him Basilius Augustus Caesar. The fact that we call God by different names doesn't mean that there's different gods. It just means that they're all names for God. Well, that's what their argument is. But then they say, but look at what's written in the next line, right? What's written in the next line, and I'll just show you what's written in the next line, is and here's the line from Genesis. It says, when God created a human being in the divine image, God created male and female, right? Oh, wait, I went too far. It's line 26. God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness, right? And then it says, and God created humankind in the divine image. It doesn't say, and God's created. It doesn't say, and they created. It says, that's why I said, it doesn't say vayivru, which is what the plural would be. It says vayivra, and that's what the rabbi says. It doesn't say vayivru. It says vayivra, which means, and God created. Remember, there's a plural and singular for every verb. Here, it's clear that God singularly created human beings. So it doesn't say they created God. It says he created God.
In our image.
Says. What?
So in our image. Can you scroll up a little bit?
Yes, it says there in our image, right?
In our image. So not just God's image, but in
wait a second.
Images
it does say that, right? And then it says, and God created in the image of God. So that's what they're saying is the rabbis are saying, look, we know that there's a problem here in the text. We know there's a problem in the text. That's why the Midrash exists. What they're saying is the problem here in the text is being exploited by heretics who are saying more than one God created. It seems like God is talking to somebody else. The rabbis say, yeah, but come on. We know what the text says. It says, and God created singularly. So you could say that maybe God was talking to the other angels in the Midrash we just read, and then he just does it. I talked to them.
Or he's
they all
talking
said
in the
stuff,
third
and I
party.
didn't even care what they said. I just did it because God is God and the angels are the angels. The other possibilities that they said is that God speaks that way because God talks about the royal we. God says, we were going to do this. And of course, when he's really talking about is himself. Basilius Augustus Caesar can call himself the royal we because he's got lots of names and he talks about himself as a royal we. Doesn't mean that he's not one person. And sometimes God talks to no one. What will I do? What shall we do here? Well, he already knows what he's going to do. He just said it like that. Everyone else is talking. Maybe they're not even talking. Maybe God is talking to no one. And God just says, well, what should we do here? And he doesn't really, he's not asking. He's not really asking. He's just talking. And that's the way people talk. And especially rulers talk that way all the time. They're not really asking for your opinion. So the possibility is he was asking the angels for their opinion. There's another possibility he wasn't really asking their opinion because he already knew what he was doing and they were just talking. There's another possibility, which is that God's just the way God talks. Sometimes God talks about himself as a royal we, and that is something that we call it the royal we because people do, in fact, the queen would oftentimes say things like, we are not amused when she's only one person. We are not amused. It's a very famous phrase that she used once in a very public setting. And so, yes, there is, in fact, that royal we. So the rabbis gave all those as possibilities, but they know that there's a problem in the text. And so when the rabbis see something that is a problem in the text, they don't just go, well, it's written by different authors, and that's why it says that. And maybe there's an author who really doesn't think that God is creating by himself. They can never say that. They never would say that. They can't. They don't even want to really, if you really want to know the truth, the rabbis really made fun of the whole angel argument anyways. I mean, it's not like they don't believe in angels. It's not the issue. But they really don't believe angels were really consulted on this. Is really the takeaway from that. I mean, that's one of my takeaways from it. It's not the rabbis are going to say angels don't exist. They definitely believe in angels. But they also want to say that God is so much more powerful than the angels. He didn't really pay attention to them. If you want to play the game out as they do with truth and kindness and these different angels there, okay, fine. We'll do that. But we really don't believe that the angels even really had any say over this, which is why they tell the story the way they do, which is just God lets them talk and then just does it anyways. But I think the point of it is really, hey, we got a problem here in the text. Let's deal with it. Let's teach from it. Let's use it as an opportunity to get some points across. And here, the point really, the real point was, don't let those heretics tell you that there's more than one God. Don't let them tell you that there's a Godhead. Don't let anybody complicate the situation. There's one God. He does everything, and he doesn't really have anything close to a helper. That's what they want to say. And that's really their teaching there. They're really teaching that. And again, that doesn't mean that people who would believe otherwise are wrong. It just means the rabbis say that's not what we believe. And we're not going to say that, we're not going to accept that as one of our teachings. Why didn't the Torah write it the way? Well, here's the problem. So Esther, you were not here last week, but when we talked about how the Torah came to us, we have to understand that there were texts in the Torah that were kept that in some cases conflict with each other. The two creation stories conflict with each other. The bigger issue, which we get in the Midrash, is this wonderful discussion, which is that in version 1 of creation, the one that we have right in front of us, we have this wonderful version of creation that it says specifically right here, as we just saw in verse 26, male and female were created together. And then we have a wonderful version of chapter 2, which I didn't have to just do that. All I had to do was scroll down a little bit more, that when God makes human beings, he first caused Adam to come up and gave him permission to eat. And then he says to him, as I quoted, Lo tov hiyot adam levado. It's not good for a human being alone. I'm going to make an ezer kenegdo. That's what I talked about at High Holidays. It's not good for us to be alone. And so what did God do? He created wild beasts out of the earth. And he wanted to see if any of the humans, if any of the beasts would make the human feel good. And they didn't. And so what does he do? He makes them fall asleep, and then he creates a woman out of it. Just so you know, Esther, there is a Midrash that exists that wholeheartedly says, with true, not unabashed, there's a conclusion to this, which is that Adam did not find a romantic partner in the animals that God created. Which is, of course, the takeaway.
Hallelujah for that.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Hallelujah for that.
Yeah. So that's why when a human being is created out of the human being says, I like this one. This one is my bones of my flesh, and I will call this one woman. So Adam, when he names all the animals, he names them, and he kind of also doesn't really get friendly with them, but yes, there is a version that he got friendly with them. By the way, just so you know, we're going to finish with this right now, but I will tell you this. I swear this 100% happened. A coyote chased me this morning down the street, and it scared the hell out of me. In the daytime, at 7:30 this morning, it wasn't even that dark. I was walking the dog, and I walked around the corner, and my coyote friend started following me. And I walked slowly, and he was still following behind me. He turned the corner and started going behind me. A car came behind, and he looked over at the car, and I'm like, great, he's gonna run away. He looked over at the car, and the car drove the other direction, and he started following me. Yes. It's not Mike. I thought I was going to die. Or at least I thought Ryder was going to die. So then I started running, and the dog, he does not running. He's just keeping up with me as I'm running. And I ran about the last 100 yards or 100 feet. I don't even know. I mean, I ran down from my post mailbox, and I walked and I ran in, and I didn't turn around again. I got in the door, and I turned around and I closed the door, and then I opened the door a little bit since the dog was in, just to see if he got me. But the coyote didn't run. He didn't need to. He was just like at a slow gait, but he was walking fast enough that he stayed with me. So if he had wanted to, I don't know what I could have done, but Ryder would have been gone. But this coyote was not intimidated, was brazen.
Problem solved.
And yeah, I know, John. The problem solved. I would not have. It would have been traumatic. So I will just tell you that I had my little my animal service came early today. Came early for me, as I got to see a coyote way too close. I got to tell you, I got in that house and I was out. Look, I knew I couldn't run the whole way, and I started running really fast the last part of it. But yeah, it was not. It was slippery too. I was worried I was going to slip as I was running, because it wasn't just like I could just full out run. I couldn't let go of the leash, so it wasn't like I could really just flat out haul, because it was like I was like, if I don't have the dog with me, then the coyote is definitely going to get the dog. So, anyways, yeah, human being and the animals used to get along a lot better when they were in the garden.
They had food.
Yes, Philip. Carry pepper spray or I've
whistle.
never seen such a brazen coyote. All right, and with that, folks, that is our discussion of Midrash. I hope you read more Midrash. What? And we're online next Wednesday. So thank you, everybody, for being here for our discussion of the Talmud and the Midrash. And now, as the rabbi said, we studied yesterday, turn it and turn it again, for it's all in there. Turn it and turn it again. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And we will see you next week, as we're going to talk about the next part of Jewish law. Take care, everybody.
Rabbi.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rabbi.
Bye. Bye-bye. We'll see you pet service.